Well, hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Emerson. I'm one of the pastors here on staff. Great to be with you all here today. As Jeff just mentioned, we are starting today a brand new sermon series through the book of Genesis. So I think we have a graphic for this. So book of Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and I'm excited to kick this sermon series off. It's going to be a 21-week series, so you can do the math on where that takes us to. But basically, it takes us from today all the way up until Christmas time. So we're in it for the long haul, but I think that we're going to be really blessed as we work our way through the book, as the tagline goes, that started it all. So that's where we're headed here today. Before I get into it, though, I did want to make one more announcement. You thought the announcements were over, but I have one more. The announcement is this. Later this month, it is August now, August 23rd and 24th, our church is hosting and putting on this event called Walk Through the Bible, okay? I don't know if you've ever, maybe you're like me, I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you start your Bible in a year plan. You start out like in January 1. And as you're reading through, you're like, okay, there's some things that I get, but there's also some things that I don't get, right? Like there's some people, there's some places, there's some stories. There's so much of it that you just start to lose track of what's going on, right? Anybody feel like that sometimes? Yeah, okay. I do. So the Walk Through the Bible, this is to help with that, okay? It's a 3-hour experience once on August 23rd from 9 a.m. to 12 noon. And then on Sunday, August 24th, 5:30 to 8:30, okay? It's the same event, happens twice. So if you're interested in this and you want to sign up and you want to come, don't come to both unless you're really like gung-ho for the Bible, okay? Maybe you do come to both, I don't know. But you only have to come once, and I guarantee if you come to this, you will walk away knowing the key characters, the key stories, and the key themes of the Old Testament. So there's a small fee. You got to register online. It's like $15. This is family friendly, so if you're an adult, come. If you're a kid, come. There might be some hand motions involved. I'm not going to give away too much, but Walk Through the Bible. You can find out more information at thecreek.org. And I also know that after service, the lady who's helping put this on, our very own Lisa Caldwell, she'll be out there in the lobby to answer any questions that you might have. Okay, announcement over. Genesis, the book that started it all. How I want to get into this book is I want to have a little bit of interaction with you here this morning to kick things off. I want to play a little game of sorts. You know, our culture has produced so many wonderful works of literature, so many wonderful movies, right? And some of what makes those great works of literature great and great movies great are their opening lines. So what I want to do is I want to give you a couple opening lines from either a book or a movie. I want you to tell me where it came from. Can we do that? Okay, let's do that. So we'll start off easy, okay? Ready? Here's the first one. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Okay, Star Wars. Thanks, Daryl. Appreciate it. All right, here's this one. A little bit harder. Ready? Call me Ishmael. Moby Dick. All right, this guy in the front row here. I like it. Okay, this one maybe a little bit harder. Actually, maybe you can fill in the blank on this one. Ready? It was the best of times. It was the... Okay, and where's that come from? Okay, you know the line, but you don't know where it comes from. Yeah, Tale of Two Cities, right? Charles Dickens, right? This one even harder. You ready? I have to read this one because I don't know it. Here you go. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a fortune must be in want of a wife. First service had it. Anybody? Any guesses? Did I hear Pride and Prejudice? Okay, I had a couple hands raised. All right, Pride and Prejudice is it. Okay. All right, here's the last one, maybe even the hardest of them all. You ready for this? You're like, harder than that one? Oh, my goodness. Oh, here you go. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. Yeah, Harry Potter. Okay, that was the easiest one, probably, other than Star Wars. But yeah, okay, so we have all these great movies, all these great works of literature. They have these iconic opening lines, and here's the tie-in. There's probably no more iconic line in all of human history than the very first line in the Bible, you know? Like Genesis 1:1. A lot of us know this passage. Genesis 1:1. It opens like this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. My friends, Genesis is a book of beginnings. It begins the great stories of the patriarchs of Israel, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Genesis begins the story of creation, how all of this got here. It begins the story of how sin entered the world, why everything has gone so wrong. And it also begins the story of salvation, how God is working to redeem humanity unto himself. But there's more, okay? Genesis also begins some great biblical themes like redemption and forgiveness and law and covenant and promise and the land. And from Genesis onward, all throughout the biblical storyline are these themes woven into the biblical text, and Genesis kicks them off. Genesis also begins the Old Testament. It begins our Bible. Genesis is a book of beginnings, and here's the last one. Genesis also begins the gracious self-disclosure of God himself to humanity. Genesis begins God's self-revelation of himself to humankind. As Genesis 1:1 starts, we see this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. A lot of times when people read through their Bibles, they're looking for small truths about ourselves. But really, my friends, the Bible is a book full of big truths about God. And it's the subject of this very first sentence, God himself, that I want to spend a few moments with you here today. I want to talk about God because, it says in the beginning, God. And so I want to ask the question, well, who is this God? You ever ask that question? Like, who is God, right? What is God like? What is God's nature? Who is this God? Like who really is this God that we sing praise to? Who is this God that we seek to obey? Who is this God that we, as we just saw over there in the baptistry, that we baptize into the name of? Do we know? Who is God? Many times when we talk about this topic of who God is, we tend to focus on certain characteristics of God, like his holiness, his love, his grace, his mercy, his so on and so forth. Those are all well and good, and those will come out as we embark on this series. But what I want to do today is I want to take a few moments and talk about not the characteristics of God in terms of his love, goodness, mercy, so on and so forth, but I want to talk about God's nature with you here this morning. Okay, God's nature. And to that end, I have three things related to God's nature that I want to suss out for us in our time together. So here's the first one. The first thing related to God's nature that I want to explore from this opening passage in Genesis 1:1 is this. It's just the idea that God just is. Thank you, Einstein, right? God just is. It's interesting that when you open up the first book of the Bible, the first sentence of the Bible, it says, in the beginning, God, that there's no reference to any reference to God having any sort of origin story, right? He's not like Superman, like born on Krypton, sent to the planet Earth, right? Nothing like that. No, Genesis just kind of assumes, like, its perspective is that God always has been, God is, and God always will be. Like, when you open up Genesis, it just kind of makes God out to just always have been. So when I say that God just is, he just is, what I'm referencing here is God's self-existence, his self-existence. Now, to help us think about this a little bit more, I want you to hop in a time machine and fast forward many years later on down the road from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and take you to the land of Egypt in Exodus chapter 3. Because in Exodus chapter 3, after God creates all things and he chooses a people, those people that God had chosen, they wind up in Egyptian captivity. Many of you are familiar with this story. So they're here in the land of Egypt. They're enslaved. They're in bondage. They're being oppressed. And there's another Israelite man out here in the countryside in the land of Midian. His name is Moses. And God wants to free his people from bondage, so he meets with Moses out here in the countryside. One day, Moses is out tending to his sheep, and as he's tending to his sheep, he sees a bush that's on fire but not burning up. And so he goes over to investigate, as one would, right? So he goes over to check this thing out. And as he approaches, here's what happens. Exodus chapter 3, verse 4 says this: When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, Moses, that is, God called to Moses from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." And what ensues is this conversation, this back and forth between God and Moses. And God tells Moses, "Hey, Moses, I want you to go to my people, go to Pharaoh, and set them free, to lead them out of captivity." And Moses, he's all over, overwhelmed with that prospect. He's like, God, you don't want me. I can't speak very well. Like, I'm not a good leader. Like, I'm not the guy. And God's like, "No, Moses, you're the guy." And then Moses, he just keeps on with the questions. He says, well, who am I supposed to tell Pharaoh, and who am I supposed to tell your people who is sending me? Like, by what authority do I have? Like, when I go up to Pharaoh and it's like, "By what authority do you have to tell me to set these people go?" Like, what am I supposed to say? And here God responds with what I think is one of the most interesting responses in all of the scriptures. Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. Here's what God says to Moses. God said to Moses, "I am who I am." He says, this is what you're to say to the Israelites. Tell them, "I am has sent me to you." Isn't that interesting? I am has sent me to you. What's interesting about that to me is that God doesn't give Moses a proper name, per se. It's not like God says, "Tell them Bob sent you," He says, "Tell them that I am is sending you." Or in other words, tell them that the God who just is the God who is sending you. Now, let's think about this for a moment, okay? This might feel heady, this might feel like cumbersome, but we're going to dive right in, okay? Let's think about this. I want you to think about, with me, God's isness. Yeah, meta, right? Let's go for it. Think about God's isness, and let's think about what God's isness means for you and for me. When I think about God's isness, his existence, the fact that he is I am, one of the things that helps me think about this is by thinking about a common question that I either ask or get asked every single day, and I'm sure the same is for you as well. Like, every single day, you either ask or get asked the question, "How are you?" right? And the common response also helps us think about God's isness, because the common response to "how are you" is, especially if you don't like the person asking, right? You just say, "I am fine," right? And then you just move on with your day, okay? How are you? I am fine. Now, the common denominator between these two sentences are the two words in the middle of each of them, right? Are and am. You didn't know you were getting a English lesson, right? But in the middle of these two phrases, are and am are forms of the verb to be. Forms of the verb to be. And whether you know it or not, anytime you ask someone, "How are you?" what you're doing is you're asking them about the state of their existence. And anytime somebody asks you, "How are you?" and you respond, "I am fine," what you're doing is you're giving somebody information about the state of your existence, be it emotional, physical, mental, so on and so forth. These words are related to the concept of being. Now, there's nothing more common in the English language than forms of the verb to be, right? Think about just the language that we use, right? Am, are, was, were, is, will be. We use these words all the time. These are simple little words, but behind the simple little words is the profound concept, my friends, of being, of existence, of isness. And so that makes me want to ask the question, where does your being come from? Where does my being come from? Where does all of creation's being come from? You know, it's funny because a lot of times when we refer to ourselves as humans, we call ourselves what? Human beings, right? But if you just think about that for a couple of seconds, it's like, well, I don't know about you, but for me, like, there once was a time when I was not, right? I've not always had being. I once was not, and now I am, and there will come a day when I soon will not be, right? And even in this in-between space, it's not like I just have static being, right? I'm in constant flux. I'm in constant change, right? I'm getting older moment by moment. I'm getting grayer moment by moment. I'm getting more fragile moment by moment. I'm getting more irrelevant to the coming generations moment by moment, right? I'm in a constant state of flux, right? So it's probably not accurate to call myself a human being, because there once when I was not, there will be a day when I will not be again, and right now I'm in a constant state of flux, so it's probably more accurate to call ourselves human becomings, not just human beings. So where does our being come from? Because that applies not just to me, that applies to you too. And it also applies to all of creation. So where does being come from? When I was a kid, I brought home a copy of Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, biologist, philosopher. I brought home his book, The God Delusion. Some of you may be familiar with that. And probably scared my parents a lot with that, but to their credit, they let me at it. And, I was a freshman, sophomore in high school. I didn't know what I was doing. So I just kind of reading through this book. And in that book, Dawkins, he observes how a lot of times Christians make arguments for the existence of God by appealing to how all of creation seems like it has a creator, how it seems like it's wonderfully designed. And Dawkins takes that, only he moves the question back one more mark, and he says, yeah, sure, everything looks like it is designed, and if everything needs to be designed in order to be, then here's my question, Dawkins said. Who designed the designer? Or in other words, who created God? Maybe you've asked yourself that question before. And it sounds like a really smart question, and it is. If in fact we need being from outside of ourselves, and everything needs being in order to be from outside of itself. But here's the kicker. Whereas you and I needed created in order to be, we don't have being in and of ourselves. And whereas creation needs to be created in order to be, because it does not have being in and of itself, my friends, God is not like you or me or the rest of creation. According to the Bible's description of God is that He just is. In other words, the Bible's depiction of God is that God is being Himself. Being is part and parcel of His very nature, His very essence. God has existence, being, isness as a part of His nature, whereas you and I do not. Only God has being in and of Himself. And actually, get this, the only reason why you or I or creation exists in this very moment right now is because not only did God create you, but God sustains you. God is upholding you in existence. He's upholding creation in existence right now. In other words, God gives some of us His isness. And God makes it by giving us His isness so that you is and I is and we all is, okay? And without God's isness, you and I, we'd be out of isness, okay? You might think of God like the sun, right? The sun gives life and energy to all of creation. And without the sun imparting its life and its energy, we'd be out of luck, right? We'd be long gone. And in the same way, only more so, because whereas one day the sun will run out of energy or whatever, God will never run out of energy. He's eternal. He's constantly upholding all things by the word of His power. What does Paul say in the book of Acts chapter 17? He's speaking to the Greek philosophers. He says, in Him, in God, we live, we move, and we have somebody help me. We have our being. In Him, we live, we move, we have our being. So God just is. I like how the theologian David Bentley Hart, he kind of sums all this up. He says this, he says, to speak of God properly then is to speak of the one infinite source of all that is. Or as Jesus remarks in John chapter 5, he says this, he says, as the Father has life in Himself, so He has granted the Son also to have life in Himself. God just is. He is being itself, imparting it to you and I each and every moment. Now, just to kind of wrap this all up, this point right here, think about, if you would, just breathe in with me for a second. And exhale. Feel your heart pumping in your chest. God, my friends, God is upholding you in existence in this very moment. And that's not just theology. That's not just like up here in the ivory tower. That's deeply real and deeply personal, is it not? So God just is. That's not the only thing that we want to say about God's nature. Here's the second thing. This one will be shorter, I promise. We don't want to just say about God's nature that God just is. We also want to say about God's nature that God is infinite, okay? God is infinite. Now, recently, my family and I, we took a vacation for my mom's birthday. We took my mom up to Niagara Falls, Canada side. How many of you have been up to Niagara Falls, Canada side, okay? USAers, get out of here, right? So we go up to Niagara Falls, Canada side. It was such a weird experience because, I went in with the expectation like, wow, pristine falls, wow, rugged nature, wow, like just that kind of thing, right? But it's like Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg is dropped right on Niagara Falls. That's kind of like what my experience was because it's such a weird thing to be like, wow, wonderful waterfall and like Ripley's Believe It or Not right here around the corner, It's a weird thing. We go and we're looking at the falls, and I'm filled with awe, and I am filled with wonder looking at the majestic thing that God created. And one of the things that you can do there is you can actually take a boat tour into the falls, okay? The falls are shaped like a horseshoe, so you can take a boat, and it'll take you into the horseshoe. And so we get onto this boat, and we're sitting at the front of the boat. We're on the top deck, and so we got our ponchos on, and so we're excited to go. And the boat is inching closer and closer and closer to the middle of the horseshoe. And at first, I'm like, wow, awesome, amazing. But very quickly, as we got closer and closer and closer, and then until finally we were in the middle, my wow turned into a whoa because, like, you just get buffeted on all sides by like the sheer energy and the force and the wind and the mist and the water and all that. I'm like sitting there, I've got glasses on, so I'm like being pelted by rain. You actually, when you get in the middle, you don't see anything. You're just like experiencing it, okay? You're just like being hit by, and really, because this is the connection. Really what this did for me is it felt like an experience of the finite meeting the infinite, Like it's like, of course, in the grand scheme of things, compared to God, the falls are nothing. But to me, my encounter with the falls, it was like, holy cow, like, woe is me, like, I'm so small, like, I am nothing compared to Niagara, right? And that is just a small taste of what it means to, like, encounter God in his infinitude, my friends. I want you to think about God's infinity with me real quick, all right? Another illustration. Recently, I had a date night with my wife a couple of weeks ago, and so naturally I took her to dinner and chose a movie that I wanted to see. So we went and saw the new Superman movie, okay? Anybody see the new Superman movie? All right, a few hands, great. Well, as we were watching the Superman movie, I got to thinking about how people think about God because I had this sermon in the back of my mind. And I was like, a lot of times people probably think about God as like a sort of Superman, right? Actually, this is the way that I imagine a lot of people think about God. They probably think about God as like this old man in the sky, but with the powers of Superman, and then you just add invisibility to all that, and then that's God, right? That old man in the sky, super fast, super strong, super good, but invisible. That's how I think a lot of times we think about God when we think about what God is like. And in some ways, there's kernels of truth to that depiction of God, but it'd be a mistake to think of God as a being like us, only bigger, faster, better, stronger, so on and so forth, right? God, my friends, is infinite. To be infinite means to have no limits. So God is not only unlimited in size or strength like Superman, God is also unlimited and infinite in his very essence. God has no limits. Think about our opening verse, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God, that's how it starts, right? But then if you just kind of look to the next phrase, God created the heavens and the earth. Like, what would have to be true about God for him to create the heavens and the earth out of nothing? What would have to be true about God for him to sustain all things continuously, day after day, moment by moment? What would have to be true about God for him to set up creation in such a way that it lends itself to the flourishing of all of creation and humanity, you and I as well? What would have to be true about God? Well, he'd have to be an infinite God to do that. Infinite in power and infinite in wisdom, right? He'd have to have no limits to be able to do that. And we see the scriptures gesture towards this reality. I like Isaiah chapter 40, verse 28, which describes God as unsearchable. At newsflash, if something is unsearchable, you cannot plumb the depths of it ever. No matter how hard you try or how long you try at it, you'll never be able to get to the bottom of it. God's infinite. I like Psalm 147, verse 5. Great is our Lord and abundant in power, and his understanding is beyond measure. Newsflash, if something's beyond measure, that means that you can't measure it. God is infinite. I think about the Apostle Paul in the book of Ephesians chapter 1, where Paul says this. He says, he has immeasurable greatness, his power does, towards us who believe. His power is immeasurable. You can't measure it. And then in chapter 2, Paul says, he writes of the immeasurable riches of God's grace and kindness towards us in Christ Jesus. A lot of times when you read Ephesians chapter 2, you focus in on that key word, grace, 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 grace. God has grace for sinners. But what I want to draw your attention to is the adjective clarifying the grace that God has towards us. It's immeasurable grace that God has towards us, that God has towards sinners. It's a grace that will never run dry. It'll never run out. God keeps lavishing his grace on broken and hurting people. That's what Paul's trying to convey. Yes, grace, but immeasurable grace. Grace that is infinite. Think with me a little bit more about God's infinity, if you will. Because God is infinite, I want you to take God's infinity and apply that to his power. Okay, so infinity plus God's power. What do you get when you do that? You get a God who's all-powerful. You get a God who's omnipotent. Now, take God's infinity and apply it to his knowledge. When you apply infinity and knowledge together, you get a God who's all-knowing. He's omniscient. Take infinity and apply it to God's presence, and you get a God who's omnipresent. He's everywhere present. Take infinity and apply it to God's relationship to time, and you get a God who always has been, always is, and always will be. He's eternal. Take infinity and apply it to God's holiness, and you get a God who's holy, holy, holy. He's infinitely holy. Take infinity and apply it to God's goodness, and he's all good. Take infinity and apply it to his love, and you wind up with a God who is love. God is infinite. He has no limits. He's unsearchable. He's beyond measure. My friends, God is greater than we could ever think or imagine. God is infinite. Now, here's the last thing as time is winding down. When we talk about God's nature, we don't just want to talk about the fact that God just is. We're not just talking about the fact that God is infinite. Here's the last one. I want to talk about how God is infinitely beyond, yet radically close to you and to me. Infinitely beyond, yet radically close. In theological jargon, we want to say that God is transcendent, but also immanent, okay? Think with me for a little bit. For God to create the world, he has to be beyond the world, right? Otherwise, he would just be a being like you or me in the world that would need to be created. Now, when I think about God's transcendence, his being beyond the world, a lot of times I think about the Ark of the Covenant. I think about the tabernacle. I think about Bezalel, which maybe you're not super familiar with that. That's totally okay. But essentially what happens is after God sends Moses to save the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage, they wind up in this area called the wilderness. And in the wilderness, God instructs Moses and the Israelites to build a worship center to worship him and offer sacrifices and that kind of thing. And so God actually instructs this guy named Bezalel to build the tabernacle, the worship center. And then he also instructs Bezalel to not only build the worship center, but to build this thing called the Ark of the Covenant, which was like this special place where God's presence resided, okay? So, and here's what we read about Bezalel building this. Here's what we read in Exodus chapter 37. It says this. It says, Bezalel made the ark of acacia wood. Then he made 2 cherubim, that's angels, out of hammered gold at the ends of the cover. He made 1 cherub on one end and the second cherub on the other. At the 2 ends, he made them of one piece with the cover. The cherubim had their wings spread upward, overshadowing the cover with them. And then the cherubim faced each other, looking toward the cover. Now, I think I have a picture of the Ark of the Covenant. You kind of get a depiction of this. There's the cherubim on top. And what's really interesting is that as Bezalel is building the tabernacle, this worship center, as he's building the Ark of the Covenant, a lot of times other nations and other religious groups in the ancient world, what they would do to depict God's presence is they would create idols to worship. Like the idol was like this material manifestation of God's presence amongst these different people groups. But what's interesting about the Ark of the Covenant for this like symbol of God's presence is that with the Ark of the Covenant, you had what's called the mercy seat. And the mercy seat was to be the place where actually God's presence resided in a special way amongst his people. And Israel thought and said and taught that God's mercy seat was in between the cherubim. Now, question. Do you see a seat in between those angels? No. What do you see? It's just an empty space, right? Why is there just an empty space? Come back to that in a moment. One more illustration. A couple years ago, I came across this Russian Soviet-era propaganda poster. You can see it here on the screen. I'll explain what that phrase is here in just a second. But essentially, back in Soviet-era Russia, there was this cosmonaut named Yuri Gagarin who flew out into outer space, and he actually said when he got out there that he went on a mission kind of to look for God. And when he got out to outer space, he said this. He said, I looked and I looked and I looked, but there was no God to be found. I looked and I looked, and there was no God to be found. And when he came back down and he reported that to the Russian Kremlin and all those people, right, they actually inferred then that because Yuri looked and looked and looked and saw no God, that there in fact was no God to be found. And that's what the poster says. It says, there is no God. That was their propaganda. But what the Russians got wrong was how they thought about God. They thought that if you got a microscope big enough that you could maybe get down into the molecule, if you could see down into the molecules far enough, then maybe you'd find God there. Or they thought that if you had a telescope big enough, you could see God out there. But my friends, God is beyond space, time, and matter. That's what they failed to realize, that God is beyond. He's transcendent. Now let's circle back to the Ark of the Covenant, right? Let's circle back to the empty space between those 2 cherubim. You know the significance of this is? You want to know what the significance is? That empty space for Israel's worship painted a picture. The empty space was a symbol. It was an invisibility that gave way to a visibility. It was a way of saying, Israel, your God cannot be contained in any sort of form of materiality. God is transcendent to those things. He's transcendent to this world. So worship the God who is. Worship the God who's transcendent. Don't worship anything made out of clay or wood or stone. You with me on this? God is transcendent. He's beyond. Now, when I think about God's transcendence, I oftentimes think about J.R.R. Tolkien and his relationship to the Lord of the Rings, okay? How many of you are Lord of the Rings fans? Got Lord of the Rings fans in here? A couple hands. Okay, I think about J.R.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. I'm not sure if you know this, but Tolkien is nowhere to be found in that story, is he? He's not Bilbo. He's not Frodo. He's not over in Elfland anywhere to be found. He's not in Mordor. He's not in Hobbiton. He's nowhere to be found in the story itself, right? You can picture Tolkien writing this story out and bringing it to completion and putting the final period on the last page of that book. You can picture him in a workshop in your mind's eye, and you can see him standing outside of that book, right? You can picture Tolkien being transcendent to that story, right? And In a similar way, that's kind of how God is to our world. He's outside of it. He's infinitely beyond it. That is, save for a specific first century Galilean named Jesus of Nazareth that enters the story. A bit more on that in just a couple seconds. But God is transcendent to our world. He transcends space. He transcends time. He's beyond it all. But and this is so important. I want you to catch this. Yes, God is transcendent. But it's precisely because God is transcendent and beyond all things. That is the precise reason as to why God can be close and radically immanent to all things, radically close to you and to me. It's because God is beyond that God can be close. Let's think again about Tolkien and his relationship to Lord of the Rings. Now, even though, as I said, Tolkien, he's nowhere to be found in Middle-earth. He's nowhere to be found in the Shire. He's nowhere to be found in Mordor. He's not Bilbo. He's not Frodo. He's not in that world. He's transcendent to it, right? Even though that's the case, there is a sense in which Tolkien is mysteriously present on every page of that book. He's mysteriously present in every moment, with every character, with every event. Tolkien is right there in the midst of it all. They're his words and they're his story. There's no character that Tolkien isn't intimately familiar with. Because Tolkien is transcendent to it, he's radically familiar and intimately present to the entire story. Its life and its tenor speak to his mind and to his heart and to his presence. And my friends, just as Tolkien is able to be radically present to every event and every character and every moment in Middle-earth, the same is true of God with you and with me. Because God is infinitely beyond, he is radically close to your world and to my world, to your hurts and to mine. If God is transcendent, then this means that in your anxiety and in your sadness and in your grief and as you're waiting on test results, that God is right there. He's close. Because God is transcendent, this means that God is not just found in the holy places, like church. Because God is transcendent, that means God can also be found in the broken places of your life and of mine. I love what Psalm 139 says. It kind of sums this up nicely. It says this. It says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence?" I realized that talking about God's nature, we got really heady, really meta. But man, there's so much amazing stuff to consider when you consider who God is and what God is like, right? We've covered three things today about God's nature. The fact that God just is, that God is infinite, and that God is infinitely beyond yet radically close. And I just want to say this as we come to a time of communion. You can get out your little cup with bread and with juice. Because God is, you and I have life. Because God is infinite, God's love for you knows no bounds. Because God is infinitely beyond yet radically close, it means that he's always by your side. And personally, it's been the recognition, I don't know about for you, but when I consider these truths about God, his infinity and his beyondness and the fact that he just is, and then I think about how the infinite became finite, and I think about how he who is put on flesh and died a cross out of his infinite love to satisfy his infinite holiness, to offer up infinite grace for a woeful sinner like myself. Why? It's like encountering Niagara Falls, you know? Simultaneously, wow. Simultaneously, whoa. When I consider the fact that God is who he is, and that despite being who he is, He loves me. And I just want you to walk away. If there's nothing else you get out of this, walk away with this. That is who God is. But despite that being who he is, actually because of that being who he is, I should say, God loves you. And we know that because of Christ's work on the cross. So we have this moment for communion. Little piece of bread represents Christ's body broken for you. We have the juice. It represents his blood shed for you. And as you partake of these elements, I want to invite you to reflect on the God who is, on the God who is infinite, and on the God who is infinitely beyond, yet radically close here this morning. You may partake at this time.